Welcome to Answers for Living. This week we want to answer the question, how do we find God's will? I had a pastor friend who was fighting with some of his board members. He was very stressed and he decided after much prayer that he was going to quit the church. He found another church, then he resigned. 6 months later, he knew that he had made the wrong decision. He ran away from a problem which he should have stayed and solved. So he called the former church up and asked if they had found a new pastor. Well, they had. Now he was in a place that wasn't God's will. What would he do now? Well, I'm happy to tell you that he's doing fine the last time I talked to him. But what do you do if you find yourself not in God's will? Let's talk a little bit about faith. What is faith? Faith is trusting God enough to do as He says. Let me say it again. Trusting God enough to do as He says. Even though we find ourselves in uncharted waters. Now, sometimes in life we aren't sure what turn we ought to make. So we choose a turn and hope it's the right one. Well, this week we're going to be looking at God's will as it relates to making right decisions. If you're new in the faith, you are just now trying to figure out what it means to follow Jesus. This may help you in discovering God's will. So how do you find God's will? Well, some Christians think God's will is a detailed itinerary. Some see it as a treasure hunt, where you begin to hunt for it, and God says, you're getting warmer, keep going, you're getting warmer. Some think it is something that's going to happen anyway, and we're sort of puppets on a string. And others see God's will as mission impossible assignment, if you choose to accept this. We're going to look at making decisions and figuring out what God's will is for us as we live our lives in uncharted waters with faith. And we're going to discover that about 90% of God's will is simply doing what the Scriptures say. Now I'm going to read a passage of Scripture from Colossians chapter 1. It's verses 9 through 12. And I'm going to read it, and I'm going to stop along the way and make some comments. But this passage of Scripture will get us going for the rest of the week. For this reason also, since the day we heard of it, we have not ceased to pray for you, and to ask that you may be, healthy, wealthy, and that everything would go well for you? No, he doesn't pray that. I pray that you will be filled with the knowledge of His will. You hear that? That you will be filled with joy of living in God's will. And that you would live in all spiritual wisdom and understanding. Otherwise, once we experience this wisdom and understanding, virtually everything else is going to fall in line. He goes on and says, so that you may walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please Him in all respects. And the truth is, we all want to do that. And we are to bear fruit in every good work. And if we're bearing fruit, it will matter to us, but more than that, it'll matter to those around us. And then Paul prays that they will increase in the experiential knowledge of God. Otherwise, that they will increase in the secret of knowing God experientially and living in His will. And he goes on and says that you will be strengthened with all power, according to His glorious might, for the attaining of all steadfastness and patience, joyously giving thanks to the Father, who's qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. Now that's God's will, and we're going to dig deeper tomorrow.